Very good afternoon, everybody, and thank you once again to Secretary Lotia for gracing the occasion and delivering a wonderful context-setting opening address. First of all, let me begin by thanking our organizing partners and our JV partners, right? DBS, ASEN, DGA, as well as Keppel, for working with us on such an important project. Now, today, our first session is talking about the case for transition credits. I should start by perhaps laying a little bit of a context of why we are gathered here today. So for about a year now, I imagine, right, Eric? We have been coming together as a group, as a project team, to actually study how we could be advancing the early transition out of the coal plant in South Luzon. But this work actually predates this particular project. I know that Eric has already been working on this for quite some time before that. And I must say that the genesis of some of these transition credits ideas actually came from the Monetary Authority of Singapore, which Ravi led prior to him taking on this new appointment as the climate change ambassador. So there is actually a lot of thinking around why we need to do this. So I propose that we organize our session today, gentlemen, if you will, by maybe covering a few sections. The first one, I think we would start by understanding why transition is even important in Asia. Why is it important to deal with this issue around early phase out for coal plants? Then I think we move on to a next segment that will talk about why transition credits would be an important way of helping with that transition. And at that point in time, I also want to draw in a financing component to it as to how we can finance the transition. Then the third part of it, I think we will talk about some of the practical challenges and opportunities that will come from doing something like that, and including touching on a very important topic of the just transition, right? So if I may kick it off right now, then I'll turn first to Ravi, because obviously it started with a lot of work that MES did on thinking about how to actually finance a transition, and it originated in the concept of the transition credits. So perhaps, Ravi, you can kick us off by providing a big picture view on why this is important and how the MES got involved in this whole thing and why we are pushing this idea of transition credits.
Thank you, Fred, and thank you for putting this together with ASEN. It's a very timely issue that we should be discussing. So let me start with, you saw the video, which I think was quite powerful, about climate change. It's not a prediction, it is current reality. It is only going to get much worse. We can make it a little less worse if we do some things right, but it's going to get worse. And so as a small tropical city-state, Singapore is deeply vulnerable to climate change. So we are committed to reach net zero by 2050 as part of our contribution. But Singapore is just 0.1% of global emissions. And we asked ourselves, what is it that we can do to ease Asia's transition? Just as we contribute towards the global trading system, global financial system, what can we do for the global climate action? And so a few data points were staring at us. One, there is no way the world will reach net zero in 2050 if Asia does not decarbonize. Asia already accounts for slightly more than half of global greenhouse gas emissions today. Its share is going to increase because Asia is growing faster than every other region in the world, energy demand in particular. So if you don't solve Asia's problem, we're not going to solve the global problem. Second, the largest contributor to greenhouse gas emissions in Asia, two largest contributors. One is coal-fired power plants. Two, deforestation. These are the two. So you need to fix these two problems. Now let's come down one step further. Focus on coal-fired power plants. 1 out of 7 tons of greenhouse gas emissions that go up into the atmosphere today comes from coal-fired power plants in Asia. So what do we do about them? It's an economic problem, primarily. Now, it's easy to say, shut down the coal plants and switch to solar, because solar is now even cheaper than coal in many parts of the world. Yes, solar panel prices have come down 90% over the last 15 years, It is indeed, in many parts of the world, cheaper. But there are a lot of unique problems in Asia that make that replacement very difficult. One, the coal fleet in Asia is very young. It's got about 30 years more on average to run. No, it doesn't make economic sense because these are backed up by powerful power purchase agreements. People have invested capex, and you can't just shut them down. Second, they are today providing electricity to millions of people. 60% of Asia's energy consumption comes from coal plants. And I just realized the same number is true of the Philippines, 60% from coal plants. You can't just shut them down. People depend on it for electricity. Added to that, energy demand is expected to double by 2050 in Asia. So you have rising energy demand and great dependence on coal. And the third factor, about 150 million people in Asia still do not have access to electricity. You put the three together, it makes this a very, very difficult proposition to shut them down immediately. Can you leave them and just meet new demand with renewables? No, that won't work either. Because if you leave these plants to continue emitting emissions, CO2, that's going to eat up most of the carbon budget we have remaining if we're having any chance of keeping global temperatures 1.5 or 2 degrees above pre-industrial levels. So this is the complex set of problems that makes it very difficult. The solution is to manage the phase out. You can't leave them forever. You can't shut them down immediately. You got to bring forward the shutdown date, the decommissioning early by 10 years, 15 years, or even 20 years. Then you have substantive reductions in CO2 without necessarily shutting them down completely today. So that was the proposition that we had. The coal managed phase out of coal. A lot of work was done on this, not just at the Monetary Authority of Singapore, but also by GFANS as one of the key pieces that we need to solve for. Now, then the financing becomes difficult. And this is where transition credits come in. Because what is the incentive for these plants to shut down 10 or 15 years earlier? It has to be through a new class of carbon credits that recognizes the reduction in CO2 as a result of the early decommissioning, and for which buyers of credits, be they corporates or sovereigns, are willing to pay. And so if you can structure the financing of this early phase-out using carbon credits or energy transition credits, then we have a forward way. So we did work on that, came up with the methodologies, and now we're on the way of piloting these projects. And pilots are important because you need to demonstrate this works in practice. This is not just theory. And that's where the only 2 pilots in the world for early phase-out of coal are both in the Philippines. There's one in South Luzon, SLTech. There's one in Mindanao. We've got to make these pilots work, learn from them. There will inevitably be deficiencies, do a next series of pilots, and scale this across the Philippines and eventually across Asia.
Thanks a lot, Ravi. I think that has been a fairly good overview around the central challenge of why we need to address coal plants. But as what Ravi has said, Eric, clearly there are still a lot of communities that actually depend on the power and electricity that coal plants actually provide. And the Philippines obviously will have that dependence and the reliance also on coal as part of its power sector. So maybe you can share with us why ASEAN would be keen on looking at this coal to clean kind of an initiative. What motivated ASEAN to initially even think about accelerating already before this pilot, an early phase out of the coal plant through an ETM kind of a financing mechanism, and then now participating in this pilot?
Thanks, Fred, and thanks for organizing this important event. As many of you know, ASEAN is the renewable energy platform of the Ayala Group, which is one of the largest and longest-standing business groups in the Philippines. We didn't start as a renewable energy platform. We always aspired. In the beginning, we set up the energy group in 2011. We always had that aspiration of being 100% renewables, but we quickly realized after our first investment that renewables was not the answer 14 years ago in the context of the Philippines. We ended up building coal plants because what the country needed was reliable, affordable energy. And unfortunately, at that time, coal was the only answer to support the very fast growth in the Philippines. That was a pragmatic move, but we believe that was the right one. So we got from 0 to 1,000 megawatts in 5 years, which was our target. But the not so good news was we were 93% coal-based and 7% renewables from an ASEN platform. But 7, 8 years ago, we felt the world shifting. Renewables was getting more competitive. ESG investing was getting more mainstream. And we thought that that was a great opportunity for us to make that bold pivot. And pivot we did. We started to divest our coal plants and basically invest everything into renewables in the Philippines, and we started to branch out regionally with the help of our partners, particularly Mitsubishi and DGA, who invited us into their investment in Indonesia, and then eventually we also expanded into Vietnam, India, Laos, as well as Australia. So we became a regional renewable platform. We had a simplistic thinking back then of divesting coal and expanding renewables, which in and of itself is already a noble initiative. But some investors and like-minded individuals called us out and said, aren't you just passing the problem to somebody else when you divest the coal plant? And that presents a valid point. That's why we were thankful in 2021 when the Asian Development Bank started to push the notion of energy transition mechanism, which is really a financing mechanism leveraging low-cost, purpose-driven financing to help with the phase-out of coal plants. We quickly latched on to that opportunity. And long story short, we got the support of our shareholders, various stakeholders, and especially the banks and new investors like insurance companies to basically put in that capital in exchange for us committing to shut down and retire the coal plant after 25 years of operations, which is 2040. SLTech, which is the plant that many of you will be visiting tomorrow, was a plant, it's close to my heart because that was the very first power plant that I built in my power career, and I had zero experience in 2011. This was new to me, a new industry, and SLTech was the first coal plant that I was participating in terms of building. And now I'm tasked to also, with the help of Migs, who's the president here, to retire it in a responsible manner, no later than 2040. So while that was a success, we were encouraged by our stakeholders, including ADB. But Eric, to Ravi's point earlier, for the world to keep to the 1.5 degree target, the world has to shut down half of the fossil fuel fleet globally, which is a very daunting task, right? So we said, and therefore, can we accelerate it by 10 years, by 2030? We said, it's impossible except if there is a financing mechanism, and we'll keep an open mind. At that time, carbon credits for early coal retirement did not exist. I didn't know about the initiatives of MAS. Ambassador Ravi was already thinking about this alongside with Rockefeller Foundation. We didn't know that. But we gave ourselves the optionality, not the obligation, but the option to buy back the power plant, SLTech, by as early as 2030, just in case this initiative emerged. That's why we were very delighted to hear in July 2023 for MAS and Rockefeller Foundation to make that big announcement supported by a McKinsey study and began pushing the notion of transition credits. And by COP 28, we signed the cooperation intent to collaborate to pilot test the world's first transition credits pilot project. So here we are today, almost 2 years into the bar. We've done a lot of made a lot of progress and milestones. Obviously, the G2G agreement is a critical one. We will do this only under Article 6 because of the high quality, high integrity nature of this initiative. We are here and glad to be supported by groups like NAT, whom we'll hear from later on, the Kinetic Coalition, and of course the various governments, the sovereign off-takers, which we're happy to discuss later on. But this is truly a whole-of-system approach, a partnership approach to enable this very important pilot initiative.
Well, thanks a lot, Eric. I mean, now that we have heard around the motivations, around why it's so important to address the coal transition problem, maybe I turn to Wee Sing. And Wee Sing, you in the bank, you're financing a lot of all these transition projects, energy infrastructure type projects all over the region. I'm wondering if you could share with us a little bit around any trends that you are seeing in terms of the kind of projects that are coming online. What have we learned? I mean, like from a financing point of view to get this transition going.
Okay, thanks, Fred. Actually, we've been looking as a bank at coal MPO, managed phase out, under the ADB ETM scheme for slightly over 3 years. We were advising INA, which is one of the sovereign wealth funds of Indonesia, to close down a coal-fired power plant in Cirebon. And we are also an active member of Traction, which is this transition coalition, transition credits coalition convened by the MAS. So a lot of learnings over the years. What we've discovered, quite evident to us, is just lowering the cost of capital to effectuate this is probably not enough, right? Which was the original thesis. Bringing in philanthropic capital, blend capital, lower returns, and close it down early. So that's not enough. So we were really very excited when we said that this is going to be paired with transition credits because we think that is key to unlocking private sector capital, right? To give that momentum to do this within that time frame for developing markets, at least within 2040. So as an institution, we have indeed been doing that compare and contrast, right, internally. That how do we compare and contrast this to bankable projects that we have done, right? Solar, wind, etc. And underpinning, I mean, I don't want to insult anybody's intelligence because it's a very smart room, but underpinning bankability for most of these projects really is three things, right? Accurate risk identification, effective risk allocation to credible counterparties, and then pricing it right. You get these things right, you get a deal banked, right? So if we do a typical power plant that I think most of us are familiar with, solar or wind or conventional, usually we bank a project through construction to operations. So that period where you fund and you don't get cash flow is not new to the market, right? This timing mismatch that people talk, it's not new. It's just the length that's new, right? So construction periods, we fund it through. How do we identify risks around construction? Is mature technologies, reputable equipment suppliers, EPC contractors who are reputable, balance sheet, performance bonds, yada, yada. The room knows this. Most of you know this. So that's done. That's done in the market. Then operations, obviously, strong off-taker, that's a given. Fixed price, stability of cash flows, that's also a given, right? Market is familiar. Operations, for a solar plant or wind plant, interestingly, over the years, after conventional, the market has had to deal with and get familiar with all these baselining or projections of sun resource and wind resource. We didn't have to do that sort of when it was coal-fired power plants and gas-fired power plants. There's a lot more certainty around it. So the market, again, is also ready with these P90, P50, P75 projections around resources. So that's during the operations piece. Strong off-taker, comfort around wind resources by reputable assessors, and then, of course, getting a good operator, right? But then overarching all this would be acts of God, natural catastrophes, commercial insurance, still there, right? We can back it off to them. And then for some markets, political force majeure, right? Where maybe sometimes the governments frustrate through either commission or omission of acts to frustrate the project. So that one, political force majeure, mostly in Asia, we've seen that backed off with multilaterals and export credit agencies. So broadly, that's how we map it and draw the similarities. Now, then we ask ourselves, a co-MPO, right, a managed phase-out, can we fit that and structure that within the frame? I believe the answer is a yes. The similarities I would draw out, but there are also contrasts, right? I don't want to be irrationally exuberant. The gestation period between funding the takeover of a coal asset to the printing of these transition credits, that we can technically call the construction period, right, that we're familiar with, right? It's just that the contrast is these periods are long, are longer than usual, right? That could be a decade. Now, with the passage of time, obviously, uncertainty and volatility increases, right? The perception of risk increases. It's not unsolvable. We think it's solvable. There are a few ways to skin the cat. We can stagger cash flows. We can either stagger cash flows through staggered disbursements, or we can hopefully accelerate some early generation of transition credits, right? Or we could defer the payment of deferred payment schemes for some of these acquisitions. So I think it's solvable, right? Industry needs to think around that. Then the mind-bending thing, at least for me, is that all my life I've been funding projects to get them to operate, right? So this is probably the first time where we finance a project to keep it from operating, because you get paid when it doesn't operate. So that's the mind-bending thing. So when you get over that mental hang-up, actually you can get across that and see that. Then how do we get the transition credits to be printed, right? So instead of commissioning, now we have decommissioning, right? We've got to make sure the plant is decommissioned. So there's a technical realm to that, which I think the industry can take on, right? But there's also a governmental regulatory risk around that, because after the passage of 10 years, if the governments change their mind and do not allow the shutdown of the coal plant, then we're in trouble. I think that we can again back off to multilaterals or export credits, because that's political force majeure, which the market has dealt with before, right, in another form. So that's the justice. Then the printing part, when the transition credits come out, now Eric and I, and most of you would know, when we commission a plant and the turbines start to turn and the solar panels start to generate, a meter will tell us the electrons have passed and everybody starts paying. That's easy, right? In transition credits, there's no meter. There are these, as I'm learning every day, there are these things called VVBs, not these things, these institutions, right? VVBs, validation and verification bodies, right? So the methodology for coming up with a product called transition credit is a design methodology that is validated and then verified. And when that gets printed, we get our money from the off-taker who's buying this, right? A credible off-taker is hygiene. I won't talk too much about that. But the printing of that, I think the industry needs to get comfortable that this is the validation. The methodology probably needs to be, in short, it is baseline emissions minus leakage minus project emissions, right? So leakage, we can take care of through possibly multilateral ECA political risk coverage. Project emissions, the project should take care of it. Now, the thing that we are still kind of working through is this baseline emissions. Again, baseline emissions, be conservative about it. That we sort of have done in wind and solar resource. We have P90s, so that's one. The only thing that we are a little bit more concerned about is there's also a talk about the frequency of reviewing these baselines. So I think the industry needs to be comfortable that it needs to be a conservative baseline, such that when there's these regulatory resets, these resets of baselines, right? Again, regulatory resets are not uncommon in financing, but when these baselines come, there is enough data for us, like sun resource and wind resource, for the industry to get comfortable that, hey, that projection around, even when baselines come in this way, that's that. Of course, the ideal for me as a financier is that when the baseline is fixed for the next 10 years, right? But if every 2 years or 6 years it gets revised, then I think we need to get comfortable, because the lower your baseline, of course, the higher the price of your transition credit.
No, I must
right?
say.
So that's the.
I must say that on the issue around dynamic baselining, which is a topic that we are frequently confronted with when we're looking at carbon projects, that is a problem that is perhaps a little bit more salient when we're looking at nature-based projects. Because especially when you're looking at counterfactuals and you're talking about biological assets, it's a little bit more difficult to actually be well granular in the predictive aspect, right, around the forward forecasting of the emissions that were avoided. Whereas for a coal plant, you have actually 10, 15 years of operating experience. You have many other coal plants of a similar type, where you can reasonably assume at a given level of utilization and particular operating conditions, how much emissions you have actually saved in that sense, right?
Correct,
so
correct.
The risks are not quite the same.
So you're right. It's just that I think the power mix and the advent of advanced technologies and all that could change that projection. So that's why we wanted to.
Correct.
You're right. It's safer than nature-based, but That is, that's the thing that we're still working
But
on.
actually, Wee Sing, I wanted to probe a little bit further, and I want to draw Eric in to perhaps explain when we think about the users of funds, right? Why are transition credit revenues actually important? Because when we think about a coal phase-out project, what are the elements of that project at high level, right, that we kind of like need to fund through a combination of the revenues from transition credits, the combination of the revenues from the future PPAs on the renewables that are meant to replace it and so on and so forth, or the just transition? Maybe you can just step us through, when we get the cash in, what are we spending the cash on?
I'll give a high-level overview now, Fred. I think there's a panel later on. I have a one page to show the details, but just to keep the audience from suspense, let me just address it briefly. I think broadly speaking, the way we think about it is there's the just transition piece, and then there is the clean energy replacement piece, right? So if we do this coal to clean transition, we shut down a coal plant. The principle behind that is, number one, we should keep all stakeholders whole. And by stakeholders, we mean the investors, the owners of the coal plant, the lenders, the workers, the communities, the customers, right? So we need to keep them whole. We need to ensure that no one gets left behind. Remember, we are, basically we have to replace the foregone cash flows. Right? We cannot, those investors don't run a charity, so we need to keep them whole. And we have to ensure that no one gets left behind. So hence, taking care of the workers and communities. And then the proper decommissioning and asset repurposing as well. So that's the just transition piece. Somebody has to foot that bill. So that is the use of proceeds, bucket one, if you will, of the transition credits. The second bucket is the clean energy replacement. Now, in certain markets, perhaps you don't need, people normally say in the video, solar is already cheaper than coal. It is true when the sun is shining, but at night, you know, so it's apples and oranges comparison. We need to make it apples to apples. And also, without going to the gory details, replacing a coal plant output really requires a large-scale renewable energy plant. And believe it or not, when I say to people that a larger plant, solar and battery storage, by the way, is required because we don't believe in the context of the Philippines that it is just to just replace a coal plant, which is steady, reliable baseload, with an intermittent solar farm that doesn't produce any power at night. It is not just. So we need to take that into consideration. But that aside, and that adds cost, that aside, the notion of scale, we are all trained in our economics class that with scale, there's economies of scale. It has to be cheaper once you go bigger. Well, to a certain extent, yes, but unfortunately, the size of our plants that are required to replace a coal plant, we are not at a scale that makes it really cheaper. So for example, if we go very small, like a 50 megawatt solar plant, that is very cheap because the infrastructure required there is almost zero, right? The connection to the grid is very zero. But once you go to 500, 1,000 megawatts, which is probably the order of magnitude we need to replace a 246 megawatt coal plant, you'll need probably 1,500 megawatts of solar, more or less. You are in a neither here nor there zone. You need to invest a lot in infrastructure, civil infrastructure, transmission infrastructure, because you cannot have a big land, 1,500 hectares, near the grid and near the population. And we need to avoid competing against food or agriculture, and we need to avoid heavily forested areas.
Yep.
So basically, we need to be far, and that requires a lot of infrastructure. It's gonna be cheaper now if we get to the 4, 5, 6,000 megawatts, but that's too big to replace a 240 megawatts. So that's that's why this project still needs a subsidy. We'll show the numbers later on, but unfortunately, there is a value gap. We don't want the price of electricity to go higher because we're replacing a relatively cheap source, which is coal, with a more expensive, firm, reliable, renewable energy output.
I think what is interesting from the comments that Eric has made, and I think it's something that we will deep dive later when we talk about the finance track, is really exactly when cash is needed. Because the question around typical project financing, right? The first time that you actually need a lot of cash for a project like that is when you need to decide to construct the renewable replacement in anticipation of the shutdown of the coal plant. And then the next big use of cash is when you actually need to buy over the coal plant in order to shut it down. So it may or may not always be the case about the long duration of the cash out without certainty of the cash in. So that is the part that I think if we can, we should deep dive later when Ganesh is leading us through the work stream on financing later. Now, one of the other things that WeSing has touched on is about methodological rigor and uncertainty, right? Because we are all interested when we're buying carbon credits to make sure that it is actually credible, it's high integrity. So if I could turn to Ravi a little bit and just get his perspectives on, get your perspectives, Ravi, on what do you think in your mind would make transition credits a high quality, high integrity carbon credits that sovereigns would be prepared to step in and say, yep, I'm going to back the demand signal for something like that?
Yeah, and that indeed is the one of the more difficult aspects of this whole exercise. We are now, to be candid about it, operating in an environment where confidence in carbon markets is weak. Prices have fallen, transaction volumes have come down. Over the last few years, some of the excitement and hope about carbon markets and carbon credits has diminished drastically. For good reasons, or maybe not so good reasons, but a germ of truth in some of these reasons, which is that there have been several abuses of how carbon credits were generated. The proclaimed reduction in greenhouse gas emissions did not occur. There were problems with verification. And on the buyer side, some corporates were looking for very cheap credits to meet carbon targets when they have not themselves exhausted their decarbonization potential. Now, we need to fix all this, and the last 6 to 12 months, there's been a lot of effort internationally. Many parties coming together to say, look, this is a problem we need to fix, because without carbon markets, we're not going to get the private financing necessary for the net zero transition. For transition credits, a particular class of carbon credits, there is the added challenge of persuading people and buyers that this is legit. There is a tendency, unfortunately, in many parts of the world to look at anything that has to do with coal with a great deal of odium and to keep away from it. And I think that's being a little short-sighted for the reasons I suggested, because if you leave it alone, it's not going to go away. It's going to come back to haunt us in climate change. So I think at the same time, when those of us who are working on these coal phase-out projects need to be very mindful that ultimately the credits we generate must have a market, which means we must listen closely to what the demand side is saying. They want high integrity credits. And that means environmental integrity. One, additionality. Credits are all about additionality. If this is a coal plant that's going to be shut down anyway in 5 years' time, it's not making much money, it's not adding much to the grid, right? You've fully recouped your capex. You can't really generate credits from those. I mean, plants like these are being shut down routinely in Europe and including in America because you've recouped everything and it's easier to just install the solar plant. So additionality is important. And the interesting thing about additionality is the baseline, because you need to determine what is the greenhouse gas emissions you are reducing that would otherwise not have happened if not for the credits. If it was going to happen anyway, you cannot get credits for it. So demonstrating additionality is central. And in the methodology that was worked out, the Rockefeller Foundation and others, that is a key point, to demonstrate additionality. Second, no leakage. You cannot have carbon leakage through the grid. So, and again, we've seen abuses of this in the past. Somebody shuts down a coal plant, tries to get credits, another coal plant springs up on the same grid few miles away. Same operator, same entity. Now this is cheating the system. You're not reducing emissions, you're not saving the planet, you're just making money through an arbitrage. So no leakage is an important principle. There must be permanence in the reduction of the CO2. which means a fair amount of replacement renewable capacity needs to be installed, because otherwise, how are people going to get their electricity? Another important dimension is all this needs to be done in the context of robust national energy plans. There must be a national energy transition plan that gives credence, because what you're doing is you are taking over a coal plant, putting money in it for its early decommissioning. You need to be assured that this is occurring in the context of a national transition away from coal and fossil fuels towards renewables. That is an important thing that buyers of credits are looking for. And so we need to also meet that. And one of the good things of the Philippines is that Philippines has the makings of a good national transition energy plan. And we need to build on that and persuade buyers that there is such a plan. I'll mention one other thing that is quite key to making this whole thing work, and that is the reliability of the renewable energy you're using to replace. And we've already touched on it. If there is no grid connectivity, I think the credibility of the whole enterprise comes into question. If you don't have transmission lines to bring renewable energy to the site, I think you have a problem. And so I think we need to address grid connectivity. And in the Philippines, that will be an important area of focus, that if you don't have the grid connectivity, then it's quite moot, as Eric reminded us, that the solar energy is cheaper than the coal energy, because you can't get it to where it's needed. It's not going to work.
Exactly. No, thanks for that. And I think that is quite a good scene setter for the methodology work stream or workshop later that we are going to be, or the track that we're going to be talking about methodology, and to understand the different aspects of where the methodologies are going, because it's not just one methodology today that's in play, but there are several, but then only one that has been approved by a standard body. And so we can understand the different elements of what makes a transition credit a high quality transition credit. But we have touched on a little bit around also what the demand side will be looking for, and that's where Nat's stream later will talk about. But I think I want to end off this part of the segment also by discussing something else, and that is the fact that, you know, the transition credits are going to represent a very big part of the revenue. And we're saying, you know, when we are lending money, we've got to worry about where the cash flows are going to come back in order to pay us back. In your opinion, I mean, are transition credits securitizable? I mean, like, can you take that as the revenues from these transition credits as something that you can bank?
I think whether something is securitizable, it's okay. Securitization is to me, different sides of the same coin around a long commitment to payment for giving of value to a long cash flow stream. That's basically it, right? How you cut it, either you do it through a prepayment, you do it through securitization, etc. So to me, it's still fundamental to what the points that Ravi raised. That the moment we can start creating that credibility, right? When there's that credibility behind the value of that, that's probably how it starts. And we have gone through the energy transition. There was a time, I think most of us remember, where we were very wary even of financing solar plants, right? And that's, I believe transition credits would have to go through that same process. And that's why I think if you want to scale this thing, let's get through a credible pilot, possibly with reputable players. I think that's the way to demonstrate it, because that's how I've seen other technologies, and this in a sense, I put in the category of technologies, take off. Because the market must also know there is a return on effort, you know. Meaning because there will be a lot of effort, there will be a whole ecosystem, a new ecosystem of players who would be validating this product. And the market must recognize that there is a deep pipeline for them to spend that effort. So just speaking very commercially from there, I think securitizable, creating value on that's fundamental. And I think we really need to prove it through a pilot that we hopefully can do soon. And I'm quite heartened that 2030 closure actually is just less than, it's about 5 years away. So that even that period is much shorter than the ones that we've been talking about. So that ticks a few boxes, and I suppose that's why we're all gathered here to try to give momentum to this thing, right?
Excellent. Now, as we conclude this panel, I want to touch on the final topic that I raised at the start, And that is about remembering that all our projects will affect communities. It's not just a environment game. It isn't just a question around the finances, but also about the communities that we will impact. So maybe this is more a question for Eric. As you are thinking about the plant in South Luzon, how is the team actually thinking about the just transition aspect of this transition? What makes it just?
Yes, this is quite central to us. In fact, as far back as when we did the stage one, which is the ETM, when one of the critical success factors of the ETM was to get stakeholder commitment. It started with that. And by stakeholder, we don't only mean Ayala Corporation being the ultimate majority owner, but equally, if not more importantly, the people working in the plant, right? As well as the broader community. So we did engage with them. We both on a group level, town hall type, and individual level. And in the visit tomorrow, you will see that the management team of the coal plant is also very much in line, in tune, in lockstep with us on this journey. Now, having said that, on the broader, on a deeper level, we're very careful about the timing of engagement across the different individuals who will be impacted, and I'll explain why. First of all, the ETM is a 2040 timeline. No one really cares about what will happen in 15 to, at that time, 17 years' time. Said, okay, noted, good one, but I won't be working here in 17 years' time. So but having said that, we had to engage with them because fake news can spread easily, right? So now with transition credits, that timeline is closer. It's 2030, it's no joke, right? So now we have to be very sensitive. Now, we want to make sure that we make the proper balance between engaging them, but not to the point that we make people anxious, right? So timing is very critical. We want to somewhat de-risk this, and the progress that we understand is already happening between the G2G. Some of the key players are here in this room between Philippines and Singapore. Once we see that really happening, and once we see the offtake getting real, then that would be the best time to engage more meaningfully with each stakeholder. But definitely the principles that we are following is, number one, these just transition plans will be individualized at the plant level. It will boil down to each individual, right? There are only 200 plus employees. It will be individual. What is customizable to each individual? Number two, we're already starting, but in an organic fashion. The good thing about this is there's still a linkage between ASEN and SLTech. We still have oversight on operations and maintenance. So we can take their people, not all of them, but one by one. I think we've already rotated around 5 or 6 people, and we reassign them to our renewable energy plants around the country. So there's proof of concept that these skills are transferable. We are already effectively starting the transition. On the community side, again, this is the first, among the first in the world, and we need to get the best practices and so forth. So for example, SLTech is the second largest taxpayer in the local community, in the local government. We don't want to leave a hole. Now, there will be the asset repurposing. So in asset repurposing, we're going to think of all the stakeholders in terms of our decision making. It's not only what's best for the investor, but also what's best across the different stakeholders, including community and the workers and so forth. So it's a balance, I guess. It's a work in progress, but also we're thinking of the sinking fund, for example, to plug any gaps that may be left behind the second largest revenue earner for the local government and the replacement business or industrial activity. So thinking about financial mechanisms to plug the gap funded by transition credits, I think, is also the way to go. So a lot of nuances, but this is to give you a flavor of how we're thinking about making the transition truly just.
Thank you very much, Eric. I think we have covered through this opening panel quite a lot of topics. First of all, around the case of why it's important to tackle this issue around coal transition, why transition credits are an important part of being able to accelerate the managed phase-out of coal plants, What are some of the difficulties and challenges and lessons learned from financing such transition projects in Asia? And what are some of the difficulties that might be associated with it? We talked a little bit about the importance of integrity and methodological rigor when it comes to the transition credits. And finally, we also touched on a little bit around the importance of thinking through a just transition. Now, the way that we have organized today's proceedings, right, for the afternoon is as follows. With this scene setter of an opening panel, we are curating 3 very, very deep dives later on after the break. The first one actually will touch on some of the methodological developments and methodological issues. I would encourage you, as Anshari is leading through that process, for many of us who are in the room who have questions around the integrity of transition credits, concerns around what does it mean to actually work on coal plants and so on and so forth, to ask as many questions as you like and to get comfortable with the way that we are approaching these methodologies. And more importantly, to also have a proper scan of the different methodological approaches that are out there and why we are betting down on some of these approaches. The second track actually looks at the issue of financing a little bit more deeply. Because this question around financing is actually not trivial. I think the more that you study this, the more you know how little we have actually touched the surface. So it is important to then think about how do we finance this thing properly? What is the proper role of transition credits? Where is the money going to? The timings and all that kind of thing. And why does that matter? Because at the end of the day, the financing will make this type of project sustainable, right? We are of course doing a pilot right now, but we want the learnings from this pilot, the model from this pilot to actually be scalable and to actually carry on with more projects, not just in the Philippines, but also in the rest of Asia, which is what Ravi was saying, right? And finally, we also have a deep dive track on the demand side, which is what NET will lead us on. Because some of us in the room, beyond just the governments and the financiers and the investors and the project operators, are also potential buyers of these credits. What should you be looking for? What would give you confidence to be able to invest in and to purchase these credits and to give the kind of advanced market commitments? Now, if you think about all of these things, we can solve the methodology, we can solve the financing, we can solve the operational side. But if no one is prepared to buy the transition credits, we can't start. And therefore, it is very important to have that dialogue now with our buyer communities to understand what would you need to see, what do you need to believe, what would you need to feel comfortable in order to be able to give that demand signal so that we, the rest of us involved in the projects, can carry on with our work. So with that, please join me in thanking the panelists, Ravi, Eric, and Wee Sing, for a wonderful opening session. Thank you.